Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey of My Mother's Son podcast. Today I'm joined with Greg Peterson, who's the host of the Urban Farm podcast and runs Urban Farm, and we'll get into that as we talk. But before we get started, Greg, just introduce yourself in your own words. Who is Greg today?
Oh, that's a good question. The final one. Who is Greg today? Today, I'm semi-retired, having worked for myself for almost 50 years. I've been self-employed. I moved from Phoenix to Asheville, North Carolina 2 years ago in search of a quieter place to be. Phoenix is 4.7 million people, and now I'm in a community of about 3,000 outside of Asheville, North Carolina, which is pretty cool. And during the process of my podcast, I get to interview some really cool people. And that's a big reason that I do it. And in December of 2022, I interviewed a young lady who is running a elderberry processing business here in Asheville, North Carolina. And she makes tinctures and salves and jams and that kind of stuff out of elderberries. And I said to her, just offhandedly, where are you getting your elderberries from? And she said, well, I get a few here and a few there, but most of them come from Europe. And all of a sudden, my head there, yeah, Dan just got a kind of a funny look on his face. And for me, it was like, oh, hold on, what did you just say? And in that moment, so I'm an entrepreneur. I've had over 35 businesses in my life. Some of them, the current one I'm running is 25 years old. And I'm always curious and looking for that next cool thing to do. So in that moment, I was talking to her. I said, well, heck, I can grow elderberries, not having a clue on how to grow elderberries. And I jumped in, and by January of 2023, I had 100 elderberry starts. And an elderberry start is 8 inches long. It's a stick. There's no roots. There's no leaves on it. It's just a stick. And I followed the directions that I got with them and added my 2 cents worth from my fruit tree program, how we nourish our trees. And within 60 days, so by April of 2023, I had 98 elderberry plants that had budded out. And in July of 2023, I planted 98 elderberry plants in the ground. We prepped them. That was a job. And uh, as they're coming out of dormancy right now in 2024, there's two of them. I lost two of them. The rest of them are thriving. And, I'm going to have some elderberries this year. So who am I right now? This new iteration, I'm an elderberry farmer. And I'm not quite sure what that means yet, but I'm figuring it out as I go.
I love it. I love it. So I always love having other, fellow podcast hosts on the show, and what you're doing is incredibly interesting. Really kind of pointing out the importance, I guess, of us looking into growing our own food,
Mhm.
as opposed to just, and I think now it might resonate a little bit more than ever, because every time you go to the grocery store, it seems like, what was in your cart that cost $50 a little while ago now costs $70.
Yeah,
And it's not going in any other direction but up.
yeah.
So, how did you kind of get in? Because I know this goes back long before the elderberries, but getting into growing your own food, like how did that come about for you?
That is a quandary that I have. I don't know. And when I was 9 years old, I was curious, and I had a paper route back then, and I was curious about fish. And we had a cabin that we visited every summer, and so I'd fish in the creek and catch some fish. But I got really curious about growing fish for food. And by the time I was 15, I was hanging out at the local fish store all the time. And this guy named Bill worked at the fish store. And I would just, as a 15-year-old, I didn't have a job there, but I just hung out there all the time and helped him. And he said to me one day, Greg, how would you like to clean a fish pond with me this weekend? And it's like, hold on, 15-year-old mucking out a fish pond, I'm in. And when we got done with that, he looked at me and he said, Greg, I'm tired of cleaning fish ponds. Now, I'm 15, remember? He said, I'm tired of cleaning fish ponds. Why don't you take over my fish pond cleaning business? He had 3 or 4 clients, and it wasn't any that big of a deal. So my mom ended up in the Pinto that we owned in the mid 70s, taking me to the jobs until I could get to be 16 years old and buy my own truck. And um, between 1975 and 1984, I used to clean, service, and build fish ponds in Phoenix. A lot of them were aquaculture ponds. So I was actually building ponds for people to grow food in. And back then, I planted my first fruit trees in Phoenix, Arizona in 1975. By 1978, I was canning my own peaches that I was growing. And so the best I can do is tell people that I was born with it because I don't have any other explanation.
Yeah.
And oh, curious thing, when I was in the 8th grade, so what, about 15 years old, I wrote a paper on how we were overfishing the oceans. How a 15-year-old in 1975 knows we're overfishing the oceans is beyond me.
Yeah.
And it's just stuck. It's like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. And, you know, my wife and I, we're actually in Arizona now as we talked before we were recording. Um, we had no idea how populous of a citrus crop there was
Oh,
in
big.
Arizona. We had no, like, you
Oh,
always, it's like California and Florida do all the marketing, but yet right now there's hardly any citrus in Florida at this point. Just about all the groves are gone, you know. So
citrus greening disease. Yep.
and but Arizona has this kind of little silent thing going, and we stayed at we do a program called Harvest Host where you can stay at local businesses for a night at no charge, and you just patronize them. And the one we stayed at had some you know orange and I think clementine and grapefruit trees on it. You could pick your own,
Nice.
and it was just really cool. And those were some incredibly good oranges
Right?
that we ate for
Yeah.
sure. So, but it was funny because both my wife and I were just like looking at each other like, man, we had no idea, that this was such a thing in the desert here in,
Oh, yeah. Well,
in
and
Arizona.
I believe it's Florida, California, Arizona for citrus in that
Wow.
order. So California and Florida are 1 and 2, um, and that is going back to the fruit tree part. That is the biggest reason I love planting fruit trees because you plant them once and they make fruit for decades or even hundreds of years. In my backyard in Phoenix, I had 2 citrus trees that were over 100 years old.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
like you treat them right and they'll give you 20, 50, 100, 200, 300 pounds of fruit every year. It adds up pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah. The lemons in my water right now are from a friend of mine's backyard in
Mm,
Scottsdale. And these
nice.
lemons were about the size of a grapefruit as well. So,
Yep. Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
again, something that goes tells you a little bit about organic as opposed to, you know, whatever else we got going on in the
Yeah. Yeah,
in
exactly.
the food industry. So, um, just so many questions. I guess going back to your original thing, um, with the what you're still doing in Phoenix now,
Hmm.
even though you're not there. Tell me a little bit about that. You said it's kind of like a Christmas tree farm for citrus, so to speak. So explain that a
Right.
little bit to the
Right.
to the audience.
So back in the mid 90s, so I planted my first fruit trees in 1975 and grew my own from 85 into 95. And in the late 90s, I wanted to plant 100 fruit trees in the ground in Phoenix. I wanted to plant orchards in Phoenix. And so I started looking for some place to buy wholesale citrus and wholesale deciduous trees that would actually grow in the low desert. And none of the retail nurseries wanted to work with me. I wanted 50 trees. I was going to start with 50 trees the first year. And I found this company called Dave Wilson Nursery. They're the biggest grower of deciduous fruit trees in the country, and they're in Northern California. And I called them and said, "Hey, I want to buy fruit trees." And they said, "Great, you have to buy 100." So in 1999, I placed an order for 100 different fruit trees for the low desert. And they arrived and I started planting them, and my friends started asking me, "Well, how do you grow them? How do we actually grow fruit trees in the desert?" And so I started in 99, 2000, 2001, started giving classes in my living room on the appropriate way to grow fruit trees in the desert, because it's very different than anywhere else. And over the next, well, we're 25 years into it now. It's called the Urban Farm Fruit Tree Education Program, and people can take classes all year round, and they can pre-order fruit trees, and the citrus come in October, which, by the way, is the exact perfect time to plant them. And the deciduous trees, as peaches, apricots, plums, mulberries, figs, pomegranates, olives, those come in January. And so what we do is we run a pop-up nursery. We're only open in October for citrus for about 6 days. So people pre-order their citrus trees and then come and pick them up from us. And we have all the supplies and so on and so on. And then the deciduous trees, they come in January. So we're open for about 2 weeks in January. That's it. So it's like a Christmas tree lot for fruit trees. And the rest of the year, I'm here. This morning I got an email from somebody. Hey, they said, "Hey, here's a picture of my fruit tree. What's going on with it?" And so I'm there for our members all year round. And, and then within 3 years, they're getting to harvest awesome fresh fruit off of their fruit trees.
Yeah. That's you actually answered my next question is how long does it
Yeah.
take to start that harvest?
So first year is about developing the roots. Second year is about developing the shoots, so the branches and that kind of stuff. And the third year is about fruits. And sometimes if you follow our directions explicitly, you'll get fruit in the second year and some fruit in the second year. And then in the third year, it comes on like gangbusters. And by year 5, so if you plant an Anna apple, let's say in your yard in the low desert, and do what we tell you to do, within 5 years, you're probably going to be getting 200 to 300 pounds of apples off of that tree every year.
Wow.
And part of what necessitated this education for me, from my perspective, is that you can go into most nurseries in every big box store. Even I'm finding that here in Asheville, and they will sell you a fruit tree that will never make fruit. It's not climate appropriate or season appropriate. And so our program, the Urban Farm Fruit Tree Program, is very specific. We bring in trees that are simple to grow and ones that will actually make fruit and an abundance of fruit within 3 years of you planting. So it's, I really figured out all of the pitfalls and hurdles for people, and then we put together over 40 lessons in our root camp program, teaching people how to grow fruit trees. And here's the curious thing that I'm finding. I've been here in Asheville for 2 years, and since we arrived, I've planted 160 fruit trees and berry bushes, inclusive of 90 of the elderberries. And in checking with the cooperative extension, the way that we plant and grow them in Phoenix absolutely works here,
Hmm.
which is, in Phoenix, we're in zone 9. Here we're in zone 6 to 7. And the strategies that we're using work they work everywhere. The thing here is that you can likely put a tree in the ground, a fruit tree in the ground, and if you just walk away from it, it's probably going to survive. If you do that in Phoenix, forget it.
Right.
It's just forget it. It'll be a goner within 18 months.
Yeah. So
So
you mentioned about the different zones. Explain a little bit more about what that means. Between zone 9, zone 6. What does that mean?
the there I, and I To be honest, I don't know a lot about them because I've never really paid attention to them because I was always just in zone 9. That's the USDA zone in Phoenix, and I just knew what grew when. And so when the numbers go down, it's colder. You get more frost days.
Gotcha.
Our final frost day in Phoenix is Valentine's Day. Our final frost day in Asheville, North Carolina is Mother's Day. So it's we have to think differently about planting, and knowing what your zone is helps you do that a little bit better.
Gotcha. Okay. Makes sense. Makes sense. So why do you think it's so important to grow
Mhm.
your own food?
So I've said for years that the most important thing we can be doing right now is figuring out where our food comes from and how to grow our own. And this is an academic piece of data from about 15 years ago. We have a 3-day supply of food in any grocery store in any urban area. That's it, 9 meals. Because of and it's pretty miraculous system. It's our just-in-time food delivery system. We want as fresh as we can get. So these grocery stores are getting deliveries every day. And if there's a hiccup in the system, like COVID or like a mega storm in Texas that we saw a few years ago, or I think it was Hurricane Ian a year and a half ago, where the impact hits, and then you go to the grocery store and the grocery stores are empty. We saw it, even toilet paper of all things, during COVID. And it makes you stop and think, what can I do? And I encourage people to grow one or two things, even if it's an herb on a sunny windowsill. You can do that. Grow one or two things and start the process, at least understanding how things grow. So that's one piece. The next piece is something called food miles. Food miles is how far our food travels from where it's grown to where it's consumed. And what would you guess that the average number of food miles are in the United States?
It's probably astronomical. I mean, I would just venture to say it's probably close to like 3,000 or something crazy like that.
Sometimes that happens. If you're in the grocery store in January and there's a peach, it's coming from South America or Australia, which is well over 3,000 miles. The average in the United States is 12 to 1,500 miles.
Yeah.
And the problem that we run into with that is that if you're harvesting a peach or a tomato and you have to harvest it and pack it and ship it 1,500 miles, you have to harvest it before it's ripe. So that fruit or vegetable isn't fully nutrient dense. In fact, there's this physiological process that goes on in fruits and vegetables where as they ripen, the bad things disappear. One of the bad things is called a lectin. Lectins are anti-nutrients. They're not good for you. So as a tomato ripens or as a peach ripens, the number of lectins dissipate and the nutritional value goes up. So when we're shipping food that far, we're harvesting food that's not as nutrient dense as it could be. And then the process kicks in. Once it's harvested, it starts degrading. Obviously not really quickly, but over time, when you pick that peach or tomato and ship it 1,500 miles, the nutrient density, which is already low because you pre-picked it, reduces over time. So we're getting food that is not as nutrient dense and nutritious for us. And when you pick a peach off of your peach tree in your front yard and you walk up and grab it, and you don't have to tug very hard, and it almost falls off in your hand, and it gives when you squeeze it a little bit, and you take a bite of it and it splashes down the front of your shirt, and the taste is just incredible. You will never buy a store-bought peach again. I can't do it. I can't do it because the taste is so incredible. So all of these reasons are reasons to plant our own fruit trees and plant our own gardens. And these days, there's so many resources out on YouTube. There's our website, urbanfarm.org. We have courses, and there's a plethora of information out there on growing your own food. And while most people say, well, I have a brown thumb, you only have a brown thumb because you haven't paid attention. Because once you get a basil plant, put it in the windowsill. If it starts drooping a little bit, it needs water. Just pay attention to it. So there you go. There's a myriad of reasons why. Oh, plus then supporting our local food system and our food economy and local farmers. Um, Generally speaking, local farmers, local growers aren't using as many pesticides and chemicals. So we're getting cleaner food. So there you go. The list goes on.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's what you're saying about grocery stores. Like I actually do the bulk of my book signings in grocery stores. I'm part of a program called National Authors in Grocery Stores. And just
Really?
by spending the amount of time that I spend at grocery stores, I see all of the moving parts that I just never paid attention to. But when you're there for a
Yeah.
5 hour span and just kind of see it and you're talking to managers and everything else, you really understand the complexity behind a
Oh,
grocery
big
store.
time.
You also look at what's in many of the people's carts and see how much processed stuff
Oh, yeah.
is going out the door is unbelievable. um so I guess the challenge that you know most listeners will bring up is the cost of buying local and trying to eat healthier compared
Hmm.
to the you know the processed crap that is so inexpensive.
Cheap. Yeah.
How do you battle that, especially with so many people, nowadays you know, in a tight position financially?
Yeah.
How do you battle it?
Well, I love that there was a young man on, and I cannot remember his name, about 15 years ago on did a TED Talk. He was like 12 or 13 or 14 years old. And the main takeaway from his TED Talk for me was, well, you can pay for it now with groceries, or you can pay for it later with your health. And we have increase in uh, incidences of obesity and diabetes and and our healthcare system isn't a healthcare system. It puts bandages on problems. It doesn't figure out what the problem is. For people that see me in person, I have a tremor on my right, and I'm showing it to you right now. And it's been around for about 15 years. It's neurological, and all the neurologists want to do is give me a drug. It's like, here's a drug, here's how to fix it. And I've been doing some natural treatments on it, and I'm finding some success. And when we eat food that's good for us, and the fact they've done studies, whoever they are out there, but I've seen some studies that converting from a non-organic to an organic diet, you will see a difference in your health within 2 weeks. So eating your own food, growing your own food, eating locally grown food, eating organic food, you're going to likely see a difference in your health by doing it. So really it comes down, for me, it comes down to health. The Our biggest expense every month in our household uh, is food. In fact, when we were in Phoenix, our house payment was less than our food budget every month. And part of the reason that we moved here to Asheville was to see how much of our own food we could grow. So I have 200 onions in the ground right now, so I'll be harvesting onions here in about 60 days. I've got a bunch of potatoes in the ground, and these are all things that you can grow and save for later. Um, so,
Yeah. So the the processed stuff, the mileage that our food's being shipped, is that a U.S. issue or a worldwide issue?
oh, I think it's a global issue. And that being said, I was in Italy in 2004 and in Croatia in 2014. And the local food systems, I like to call it the local food economy, but the local food systems in both of those countries are thriving. There was one in Zagreb, Croatia, when I was there for 3 weeks, and it was on a food systems trip for Arizona State University, who I used to work for. And they had a farmers market space that was halfway indoor, half of it was indoors and half of it was outdoors. And it had to be on 5 acres. And there were hundreds of vendors, and they were open every day. And the other side of that coin was as I walked through the neighborhoods and checked in with the different people that we were visiting with, most everybody was growing their own food.
Hmm.
Most homes had their own gardens. And, I looked down my street, which is about 25 homes, and there are two other people in 25 houses besides me. So three of us grow our own food. The rest of the people don't.
Right.
And I think there's real value in building a community around food. And that's what I saw in both Europe, in both Croatia and Italy, was that there was a thriving local food economy. And the other side of that coin was one of the clinchers for us to move here was when I did a visit to vet the house that we ended up buying. There were billboards around town. Some of the billboards says local, get your local compost from us. This is on a printed billboard. Get your local compost from us. And the other billboard said, uh, download the app for the local farms in the Asheville area. And it's like, wow. Okay, so this community is a lot farther ahead. The local food economy, the local food system here is thriving more than I've seen it in other places.
Yeah. So so how do you go about changing the thought process of, how we go about getting our food?
Well, I have this theory, and it goes like this. 99% of the time people change because they get hit by a Mack truck, metaphorically, of course.
Right.
Well, some people might get hit by a Mack truck. And 1% of the time people change because they choose to change. And my podcast and what I am about in the world is helping people see the need to make that change. And so 1% of the time people jump in and start growing a garden. 99% of the time COVID hits and we start doing free garden classes. So in March of 2020, this was shutdown was imminent. I looked at my team and I said, let's do a gardening class, one gardening class a day for 90 days. And we'll just put it out there. It'll be free and people can learn how to grow their own food. And we ended up adding like 25,000 people to our email list in that 90-day period of time. It was mind-boggling. And we ended up, over 90 days, we ended up giving 62 classes. And these were all classes on giving people strategies to change the way they think around growing their own food, whether it was a sourdough. We had a lady come in and talk about sourdough. We had one guy come in and talk about humanure. That's, human waste into compost. And then we had a flower farmer come on and rainwater harvesting. And, there was just thing over thing over thing that we talked about to get people to think differently about where their food comes from. And that's really what I'm all about.
Yeah. Just educating
Yeah.
educating before the Mack truck hits you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the Mack truck doesn't need to be, I'm not talking Mad Max here. I'm talking COVID. I'm talking inflation. I'm talking storm. I'm talking things that happen every single day. Obviously, COVID doesn't happen every single day, but things, cultural changing things happen every day. And it's a good idea to think through them and figure out where our food comes from.
Yeah. And how many acres did you say you have there in Asheville right now?
4 acres.
Okay.
We went from a quarter acre. So the house that I lived in for 32 years in Phoenix, it's called the Urban Farm. And the new owners that bought it from me were thrilled, and they're continuing the work there and continuing the landscape. But it has an old growth food forest. That's what we call it in permaculture. I like to call permaculture the art and science of working in the flow of nature. And what I had done over 32 years at that property is I had planted plants that would regenerate themselves from cucumbers and parsley and basil and cilantro and sweet potatoes. And that once they got planted and established, they would just come back year after year after year. So it would be like wild harvesting your yard. And that's what I'm in the process of doing here. Um, the quarter acre around the house is where we're doing our harvestable food forest. And then I have about an acre and a half of forest back there that, has mushrooms growing in it. And there's many things that can be actually grown and wild harvested out there. So I'm looking at that. That's something new to me. And, I'm figuring it out.
And everything you're growing, is it um, just for you, or are you selling some of this stuff as well?
Um, the way that the urban farm food forest was designed, it was primarily for us because it's not a farm. So we weren't producing thousands of pounds of carrots and like that. We would produce maybe 15 or 20 pounds of carrots that would be harvested throughout the year when we need them. So whenever we, like here in Asheville, we've got some gardens that we've set up. And when we want a salad, we go out and pick salad greens. So it becomes the goal is to put a landscape in place that just feeds us. I had this thing happen in 1991. A friend of mine went sailing in the South Pacific, and they anchored on a property, or I'm sorry, they anchored in an island, and they were looking for a grocery store. And the people on the island looked at them funny and said, "Go pick your own." And he came back to Phoenix and told me that story, and that for me was a life-changing moment. I had previously read Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. It's a book about how our food system basically locked up the food. It's a work of fiction. And Quinn outlines what's happened over the past 10,000 years. And he says in the book that food used to be free. So why can't food be free now? Well, it can. And my intent here coming here wasn't to actually grow food to sell it. It was to figure out how much of my own food to sell, that I could grow. And we had this amazing thing happen last summer. I make worm castings. So I take all my compost, it goes in the worm bin. The worms do what they do and they eat and they poop. And what comes out of the bottom of the worm bin is called worm castings. It's gardener's gold. And I put a handful of gardener's gold in every single fruit tree hole as we were planting out 160 fruit trees last summer. And one of the things that ended up magically in the worm compost bin were tomato seeds. Not quite sure how so many of them got in the worm bin. But what happened is tomatoes came up around the blueberries and the elderberries. And in July, August, and September of last year, we were harvesting 5 pounds of tomatoes a day.
Wow.
So what I did, and I had this thought when we purchased this property, because it's on a main road, and then there's another road to the other side of the house that has 25 houses down it. And I had this thought when we bought this house, wouldn't it be cool for us to be able to grow food here and just put a farm stand at on the street down below? So we were harvesting tomatoes every day, and I put a little table on the street and put free tomatoes from Heidi and Greg's farm. And we made so many friends from them just picking up tomatoes. The neighbors were bringing us things and making food for us. And it was like, okay, when you have a party, where do people gather?
Yeah, around
Around
the
the
table.
around the table, around the food in the kitchen. And that's what happens when you build a thriving local food system. And so that's what I'm working with here. And I'll probably continue that, picking things out of the garden and putting them on a table down below and sharing them with the neighbors. And the next thing I want to do is one of the neighbors works at a nursery, and they're a plant start nursery, and they're a large plant start nursery. And talking, I'm going to go talk to him and see if we can do vegetable plant starts for the neighborhood and start giving away plant starts for the neighborhood. So
Very
that
cool.
we, get everybody thinking about, okay, I can grow my own food.
Very cool. So what type of guests are you interviewing on your podcasts?
Rock stars, literally rock stars. I've had Jason Mraz, farming rock stars like Joel Salatin and Elliot Coleman.
Yeah,
And
Jason Mraz does avocados, right?
he does
Yeah.
avocados and coffee.
Oh, I didn't know the coffee. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, something like it sells for like $700 a pound or something
Wow.
like that. But with the climate changing the way it is, they're finding that San Diego, I have a very good friend in San Diego who is a coffee farmer and consultant for that, and avocado farmer and consultant for that as well. And over the past 10 years, it's warmed up enough there that they're able to grow coffee.
Hmm.
And, they're just rocking it there. So rock stars, both from music and from the fruit and from the farming community, and backyard rock stars. I had this guy, and he listened to so I'm 8.5 years into the podcast, 850 episodes, and he's been listening to my podcast for 4 or 5 years and getting inspired. And he retired at 50 and started with a 10 by 10 garden. Then it was a 10 by 20 and a 20 by 50 and a 50 by 100 garden. He was actually growing a garden 50 feet by 100 feet, which is a
Wow.
huge garden.
Yeah, it
And
is.
the thing I say often is that the only place that lack lives is between our ears, because when we look at the sheer amount of abundance that nature gives us, it's mind-boggling. And he was running into that problem. So then he ran across one of my podcasts on going to the farmer's market. And last fall of 2023, he harvested food out of his garden and went to the farmer's market and had a blast. And he contacted me in December and he said, "Hey, Greg, can I come on your podcast and share my story?" It's like, that is the ultimate for me,
Yeah.
where somebody's listening to my podcast, they get into action, they do what we talk about, and then they come back and share their story. And he was just a backyard farmer.
So cool.
And I'm going to not downplay because just a backyard farmer can feed our communities.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible. Greg, is there anything that you think we missed throughout this conversation that you feel would be important to the listeners before we start to wrap things up?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'd like to share a link for some free education.
Absolutely.
And I've been growing fruit trees for, well, almost 50 years, and growing them professionally for 25 years in Phoenix. And we put together this series of about 40 different lessons, some short lessons, some longer lessons. And it was specifically built for the Phoenix Low Desert. And it's called our Root Camp program. And what I found was, when we moved here to Asheville, all of the stuff we're doing in Phoenix works here. So this is a program that can work for really anybody. If you're planting fruit trees in the ground, follow these directions and you're going to be successful. And you can find it at urbanfarm.org/root camp.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure that gets into the show notes as well, so people
Cool,
just click
thanks.
it and check it out. Um, so where else can they find you if they want to start listening to the podcast and hear some of these stories? Where can they find you at on the internet?
urbanfarmpodcast.com. We're on every, you know, podcast platform out there. So if you just type in Urban Farm Podcast with Greg Peterson, we're in the top 1% of all podcasts out there. We get a lot of listens, and I think this is a lesson I learned um, as a young backyard farmer 20 years ago. When I went back to college, I went back to college at the age of 40, and I started growing food. I was growing food, and I was started harvesting it every day and taking it to a farmer's market. And so on Wednesday, I would get up in the morning and I'd harvest what I had and I'd go to the farmer's market. And what they told me back then and what I experienced was that if I missed a week, my sales would go down. So that lesson I brought forward to the podcast. And in 8.5 years, we've never missed a week on purpose because people are counting on us being there.
Yeah,
And then you can find us at Urban Farm on Facebook and Urban Farm U on Instagram.
very cool. Excellent. So, Greg, that brings us to our final question. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is "Many Little People in Many Little Places," which comes from the opening lyrics of a Michael Franti song, "Gloria," which go, "When many little people in many little places do many little things, then the whole world changes." So, it's one of
Yes.
the little things that Greg does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place.
Well, my podcast for sure. I'm deeply committed to changing our global food system. In 1991, I did a seminar at a place called Landmark Education. It was their advanced course, and they had me create a vision for my life. And the vision that I created was that I'm the person on the planet responsible for transforming our global food system. Now, I'm clear that I can't do it alone, and it's what gets me up every morning. It's what gets me sharing in a positive and happy way, getting people to grow their own food. And yeah, that.
I love it. I love it. It's
Thank
a
you.
great answer. Greg, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me on the show today. Great conversation. I think, hopefully some listeners out there, take it to heart what we were talking about and, jump on and take advantage of some of your resources and start growing their own food because I think it's something that could definitely change the world for sure. So I really appreciate the time. For folks out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. Greg, again, really appreciate the time. It was a great conversation.
Thank you for having me.
You bet.